decline in what we call initial attack success. But an interesting thing that happened after the 70s, we also just started ramping up how many firefighters we have out there. We have all these planes, we had all of these able-bodied workers out there fighting fires, so we had way more suppression resources than we did in the past. But yet we still had more fires escaping initial attack. And what you're looking at in the bottom here, all these little bars here, is how many acres burned. And we normalize it per million acres, but that's kind of like a density of how many acres are out there in the landscape burning in any given year. And you can see that that just keeps going up, even though we keep putting more and more firefighters out there. So what the heck is going on? But we still claim that, we're still upwards of like this 98% success in initial attack. So I work with some folks out of the Missoula Fire Lab. Have you guys heard of the Fire Lab over in Missoula? They're pretty well known. They do a lot of cool stuff out of there. And some of the research that we worked on was looking at how many resources. So when I say a resource, I'm talking a firefighter, an engine, maybe it's a helicopter, it might be an airplane. How many resources go out there to attack a fire during this initial attack phase, and how successful are they at putting it out? We did all of this research to find that no matter how many resources you had, whether it was one or whether you put 7 to 8 people out there within the first 24 to 48 hours, you never really got above 94, 95% success of putting those fires out. So there's still 5% of fires that no matter how many resources we throw out are always going to get away. And I think that's important for us to remember, because we're not going to get rid of large fires. It's not an option out here. And for many reasons, you guys are ecologists in this class, you know that we don't want to get rid of fire all the time. So I really liked this because it really lines up well with the Woody Allen song. I don't know how many folks in this room know Woody Allen, who he is, but he has a quote of saying that 80% of life is just showing up. So 80% of fighting fire is just showing up. And even if we didn't show up, 80% of those fires will go out on their own. And why would they go out on their own? It's because of where they start. Most of the time, maybe they start in just a single tree in the middle of a scree field or in a rocky patch up high. Maybe they started and the next day a snowstorm came in. That happens quite often. You get a lightning storm come through and then you get rain. 80% of fires would probably go out even if we never went and addressed them at all. So really our success rate starts looking a little bit worse, right? When you're like, well, okay, so now you're only looking at 10% that maybe you kind of put out, 4% get away. What about those 4% that get away? That's what I'm going to focus on today. So this is me just kind of capping that for y'all. Just that efficacy and initial attack hasn't changed in over 100 years. But what has changed is that firefighting's become more expensive. We're seeing more damages now. More homes are burning down. More lives are being lost. And the fuel conditions, how those fires burn across the landscape is changing. They're burning hotter. They're burning faster. So the big thing here, like I said, is no matter how much suppression efforts we put out there, we're still going to have to deal with these large fires, these big fires that occur. This here's some more just historical data to convince you that I'm right. These are the number of fires per million acres in 1910 to 1920. This is the same chunk of number of fires from 1992 to 2013. Nothing's really changed that much. Are you guys familiar with these box plots, box and whisker plots? So they changed a little bit, but really the distribution hasn't changed all that much. This is the number of fires that we've seen in the past. And this is in the state of California. California is in the news all the time because it's always burning down. So it's a pretty important case study for us because it does feel like California is burning more often, right? And then when we even look at how much of California has been burning, number of acres burned didn't change from 1911 to 1920 all the way up to 1992 to 2013. And your guys are probably thinking, yeah, but 2020, 2021. These are huge fire years in California. The biggest fire that we've ever seen in modern firefighting history, million-acre fire, just happened in California, the Dixie Fire last year. So I would expect that we're looking at something different. This is the number of acres that burned in 2021, 2.2 million acres. When you normalize it to your density metric, which is what we were looking at before, it puts it right here. We didn't burn that many more acres in California in these last couple of years than we have in the past. It's just it was one fire instead of a whole bunch of small fires. So that's the big difference there. We're talking about patch dynamics and size dynamics of these fires. So instead of getting 100 fires across the landscape that are maybe a couple thousand acres, you have a million-acre fire, and it's concentrated. That means that you have much more of your landscape burning at the same time. What we like to see in ecology, as you guys are probably figuring out, is diversity is the key to life, right? So we want to have our landscapes be as diverse as they possibly can. We want to have patches where you have high severity fire. You have patches where new trees are growing up. You have patches of old growth. And that's what supports a wide variety of ecosystems. When you burn 1 million acres at once, all in one big patch, you lose some of that diversity. You're going to reset the clock on a whole big chunk of your landscape all at once. That could be problematic. Similar to when we start looking at agricultural systems in the Midwest, and you just grow corn, as far as the eye can see, and then you get a disease that comes in and likes to take out corn, and it takes out all of it. We want to have diversity in our systems. So having a lot of smaller fires is a good thing. One big, large fire might not be great. Interestingly enough, if we go back even further in time in California and look at how many acres burned before modern firefighting, somewhere around 1910, this would have been triple the number of acres than what we're looking at now. Way more acres burned. And that's because people were going out and intentionally lighting fires all the time in these landscapes. And so we burned way less now than we ever have in the past. But we're seeing way bigger damages. So that's what I want to talk about a bit too, is why do you think 2 to 4% of those fires, despite our planes, despite all the firefighters and their Nomex running out there, why do they get away? Why can't we put them out? Anybody have any guesses?
Fuel and combustibles.
What was that?
A lot more fuel and combustibles that are present.
Fuel. That's a great answer. Any other ones? No? There's a lot of answers out there.
And this number hasn't really changed.
What was that?
Dry conditions.
Drought and dry conditions.
But this number hasn't really changed historically. This is pretty much.
It's still about the same.
Yeah. It's not necessarily a change in the system. It's just always been that way.
We've always lost 2 to 4% of fires since we've been trying to fight it. This is going to bring me to my next definition of chaos. So chaos, in a physical sense, is defined as behavior so unpredictable as to appear random, owing to great sensitivity to small changes in condition. So a chaotic process is something that you can't predict. Maybe it's the stock market. There's some ability to predict that, but not great. Anybody ever been to NCAR in Boulder, Colorado? Anybody know what I'm talking about? We've got one person that's been there. Yay for dorms. NCAR is the Northern Climate Atmospheric Research Center in Boulder, Colorado. And they do all these global circulation models. They do all this great stuff on climate change, all this really neat things. And they have this great display when you go into their lobby. It's like all these things for kids and engaging yourself in science. And of course, I had to play with them all because they're super fun. And they have this great display there talking about chaos and what a chaotic process looks like. So really easy way to describe it would be picture a pendulum. We all know what a pendulum is, right? And it's pretty predictable. It's very predictable. In fact, this is how we started telling time a long time ago, right? So you have one pendulum going back and forth. It's a very predictable pattern. But if you put another pendulum on the bottom of that pendulum and swing it, it's much harder to predict where things are going to go. But using fancy computers and fancy math, you can still predict where the direction that those are going to go. And you put a third pendulum on there, and you can't predict it at all. It's a completely random, chaotic pattern. It's not something that we can predict. And the reason that I bring up NCAR and I bring up physical chaotic patterns is because it's a very similar pattern that they study that creates chaos and wildfires. So I thought we would go to some basics of fire. So fire folks love triangles. You have a lot of different triangles. This is the most basic fire triangle. This is from chemistry. Who said they were in chemistry here recently? I thought I heard somebody saying, there we go. You've seen this one before. This is basic combustion. You need oxygen, you need a heat source, and you need fuel. Right, so this is your basic fire triangle. We extend that to the wildland system by looking at oxygen being driven by weather. Fuel is now your vegetation types that are out on landscape, sometimes homes as well. And then heat is really driven by topography in the system. So you still need an ignition source, but heat rises, right? So you have slopes, heat wants to go up those slopes. And there's a lot of other things that play here. But in this triangle, which piece do you think is the most chaotic? Weather, for sure. Everybody says if you could predict the weather that you'd be a millionaire, and I probably wouldn't be standing up here right now, but if you could predict it with 100% accuracy. That's why when we listen to weather reports, there's always some kind of probability associated with it, right? So you have a 50% chance of rain, 60% chance of snow, which if you're a skier, you know 60% chance of snow really means a 5% chance of snow.
Stay home.
Yeah, you might as well go back to bed. Of these weather things, which one do you think is the hardest to predict? Can you guys see those?
Yeah.
We have wind, temperature, humidity, and precipitation.
When
Wind. Wind is really, really hard to predict. And especially the kind of wind that drives fire systems. So the people at NCAR, they look at winds at an atmospheric level. They're really looking at them at a much higher, what we call as the general circulation. So how the atmosphere moves around the world. And those winds are a little bit easier to deal with. But once you start getting down to the surface level, wind is interacting with trees, it's interacting with buildings, it's interacting with the topography, the type of vegetation that's out there, and it creates a pretty chaotic process for us. So what happened in 1910? Does anybody remember the 1910 fires? Anybody here remember the 1910 fires?
hardly remember, it's not heard of.
All right, we got some people that have heard of it at least. All right, so the 1910 fires happened in northern Idaho and western Montana, pretty much Missoula over to Spokane, that I-90 corridor. If you ever drive the I-90 corridor, you can see the remains of some of this fire. It's really cool. There's Wallace, Idaho is kind of where ground zero was. This is a picture of Wallace, Idaho. And there are still cedar trees that burned in the 1910 fire that you can see their stumps. They're burned out stumps and they're still on the trail. It's really neat. So they have a whole fire ecology trail if you're ever driving to Spokane for some reason and you just want to stretch your legs. I highly recommend get out on that trail in Wallace, Idaho, walk it. It's a really interesting story. Ed Pulaski is the hero of the story, and you get to, on that trail, climb into the tunnel that he waited out the fire, the 1910 fires. It's pretty cool. I think it's pretty neat. Anyway, what happened in 1910 fires? Well, the summer of 1910, there was fire all over the landscape. Like hundreds of fires were burning. They were all pretty small. They weren't really going anywhere. Most of them are started by the trains. So we had this massive system of railroads going around and collecting lumber, collecting coal, collecting everything, copper, and they started fires all over the place. So there was a lot of fire on the landscape all summer long. They had, the Forest Service was bringing in lots of firefighters from all over the country, just hiring whoever they could. A lot of these people, we didn't even know if they were immigrants. We had no records of them. So when we talk about what happened in the 1910 fires, we still don't fully know the extent of it, because we don't really know how many firefighters we even had at the time. There's a lot of people out there working on these fires, trying to get them out, but they were all pretty small until August hit. And it was like August 21st, which is ironically my birthday. August 21st, a big cold front moved through. And if you know weather patterns, what happens in front of a cold front is that you get really high winds. And this was a massive cold front. So this cold front, the winds that were created from this cold front lasted for 3 to 4 days. And they were like 40 to 60 mile an hour winds. So you have fire all over the landscape, and all of a sudden this massive wind event lasted for about 3 days. And we had over 3 million acres burn. It burned through the town of Wallace. And that one day when everything just exploded is called the Great Blow Up. And it was really driven by wind. Interestingly enough, how many people were in Montana in 2015? We got a couple folks. And that summer, there was a lot of fire on the ground in August. And it was August 20th, we started looking at this massive cold front building. And we were like, oh boy, here we go. All of the fire behavior modelers in the West had the butterflies at night. And we're like, are we gonna have another 1910 event? Like, there's a lot of fire on this landscape. Sealy Lake, if you remember, was evacuated from smoke. The Lolo Peak fire burned outside of Missoula. There was just fire everywhere, and there was already really big fires. So these weren't small fires just hanging out on the landscape. We had a huge ignition source. Luckily, we dodged the bullet there. The winds never came. They came a little bit, but not like they did in 1910. So it was just interesting the way that they built up, the same pattern built up. What was different about it was this chaotic process of wind, which really was driving a lot of those systems. So again, why do these 2 to 4% get away? Well, we put out most of the fires when they start in mild and moderate conditions. That's the low-hanging fruit, right? It's like pretty easy. You just kind of go out there with a bucket of water almost and throw on them. But we do this across all of our vegetation zones. And what that means is the fires that end up burning out there on the landscape, the 3% or so that get away, are really burning in the most extreme conditions. They're the ones that are burning under a lot of heat, and they're wind driven. They've been pushed by winds out of where they were before. So we get this event called spotting. And spotting, anybody who stood next to a campfire with a down coat on knows what I'm talking about with spotting, because it is those embers that flicker off from a campfire and are going to burn, inevitably put a hole in your new coat. But when you have a wildfire going, those spotting embers can land miles away. Interestingly, we had a fire down in Colorado, southern Colorado, that was burning outside of Durango. I don't know if anybody here has been to Durango, but the Continental Divide Trail goes up and over outside of there. We have about a good 2 mile stretch of alpine, pretty much rock. So everybody's like, well, the fire will hit the Continental Divide and then that's it. Well, a big wind event came up. We saw spotting go 3 miles straight over that rocky front, landed on the other side, and we were off to the races on the other side. It was pretty incredible. So those embers can spot far, and they can be really dangerous to firefighters. They can put fire in a spot that you're not expecting them to be. This picture here, kind of hard to see, but this is what we call a fuel. Imagine this. This is a fuel break. So we went in and did some thinning along this ridge here. So we took some trees out, and in hopes that you would stop the fire as it comes through. This is very common practice in forestry, trying to create some fuel breaks to protect something else. Well, the wind just spotted it right over, so you can see that this fuel break didn't burn itself. It did really great right in the fuel break, but it's black on both sides. So if your intent here is to stop the fire from moving from here to here, it didn't work. But what if your home's like right in the middle of there? Oops. Smart screen, see. If your home's right in the middle of there, this might have been pretty good because now you just have, the fire didn't burn through there. It didn't burn through that zone. So we'll talk about that in a little bit too. All right. So we talked about why the 2 to 4% get away, and I kind of want to focus on what happens when 2 to 4% of those fires get away. And this is what happens. Sometimes we're seeing more and more news articles like this: Paradise, California, destroyed by wildfire. Greenville, mountain town, destroyed by wildfire. This was just this summer. Nothing can stop it. The McKinley fire destroys the town of Klamath River. This one is baffling to a lot of ecologists here. The mass death of sequoias. We lost about 40% of our giant sequoias in one fire season. Anybody know anything about giant sequoias?
It's a long time to get that way.
It does take a long time. What else?
Fires.
Well, giant sequoias are about as fire adapted as you can get. They have bark that's feet thick. I mean, really thick bark to keep the heat away from where all of the good stuff happens. So these trees, the matriarchs, you can see one here in this picture, they call the biggest trees in the sequoia groves matriarchs. They've been around for 3,000 years. They've seen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of fires. And now all of a sudden, they're dying. What's going on here? Anybody have any guess?
Screen ground cycles maintenance that even their connected layers are just timber, basically.
That's part of it. We have drought, so things are a bit hotter and drier than they have been in the past.
The fire itself is more intense.
The fire is more intense.
Probably more fuel around it, but just because we haven't been letting burns happen in the area in the first place.
Absolutely. There's way more fuel around these. Sometimes one of my team members works almost exclusively in the Sequoia systems. He's part of the Save Our Sequoias emergency response team that just got initiated this summer. He said that some of those sequoia groves are so dense that you could be standing 20 feet away from a matriarch and you wouldn't even know it. You wouldn't even see them. That's pretty impressive because in the past, these would be almost like a park or a savanna. You would have a big, huge tree, kind of grasses in between, lots of clearing. Everything's really dense in those stands now because we just keep putting out all of the fires. And we're not harvesting any of the timber that's around them anymore either. So it's a double whammy on those. Interestingly, the Park Service has taken a different approach, and they've been continuing burning in a lot of their sequoia groves. So this summer, one of their sequoia groves was threatened by fire. It came in, it burned through, went away, no sequoias died. Pretty big deal. These trees are really amazing. If you guys haven't gone over and seen them, I highly recommend taking a field trip. They're one of my favorite trees. And I don't like to play favorites, but I have a couple favorites. So we have a system that's a little out of whack, and that's driving some of this as well. We have something else that's a little out of whack here. I like to kind of think of this more as being if a tree falls in the woods and nobody's around to hear it, to make a sound kind of thing. We had all these fires burning in the past, but they weren't interacting with things that we really cared about too much. They were just happening in the backcountry. Maybe there was early 1900s, you might have had a forest ranger out there looking, making sure that they weren't burning down all of our timber stands. But for the most part, they weren't interacting with our communities. They are now. They certainly are now. The Camp Fire in 2018 destroyed over 18,000 homes. The Bridger Peak fire over in Bozeman was 68 homes. This stuff's happening more and more. We're seeing thousands of homes burning in a single event. You're seeing pictures of Target and Kmart burning in wildfires now. That's not something that you used to think about, that you'd see wait a minute, Target's not in the middle of the woods, it's downtown. I'm safe if I'm downtown. And we're seeing that that's not always the case. once fire starts getting into these communities, what happens is they start hopping from house to house to house. And you're no longer in a wildfire environment. You're in what's called an urban conflagration. And it's a different environment to work in. It's really dangerous for firefighters. You've got propane tanks. You have all of these hazardous materials that you build our house out of, plastic, all the stuff that you're having to breathe in, let alone all the people that you have to get out of the way. I don't know if you guys have watched the little documentary on the Paradise Lost. You guys should check it out sometime. It's pretty neat. It's just a 20-minute documentary, I think, on the campfire and how it burned through Paradise. And I'm telling you, it's terrifying. You have people sitting in their cars, just unable to go anywhere, total traffic jam, and fires just burning everywhere around them, including a school bus. We were really lucky that more people did not lose their lives in that fire. So what is this all? Unfortunately, we're not always that lucky. Quite a few firefighters have lost their lives. This number is going up every year. Civilian casualties are going up every year as well. So we've got a different environment happening out there. We have a different system. There's more at stake right now than what we had in the past. So that's a big difference. Even if we're burning the same amount of acres and we're burning the same number, in some instances fewer acres, the stakes are quite a bit higher. So we got a problem, right? And what do we do about it? So how do we deal with this chaos? And kind of like this little cartoon, because I think this is what a lot of people want to do, is that instead of risking anything new, let's just play it safe and we'll just continue our slow decline and just keep doing the same old thing that we've always been doing. And that's like, we'll just double down on it. We'll put 3 times as many firefighters out there. We'll get 20 more helicopters. We'll get 100 times more air tankers, and we'll just double down on the same old, and it's not working. So instead, we're learning. We are learning an agency. The fire agency in particular takes this stuff pretty seriously. So we've been looking at using risk management to be more effective and safer when it comes to firefighting and planning before a fire breaks out. So anybody out there backcountry ski, climb, mountain bike, ride horses, go hunting? There's a lot of different things that we do in a day, just walking to school sometimes, that require risk management. And what risk is when you have a hazard out there. There's a hazard present. Maybe it's a car that could hit you as you're crossing the street. And you have something that you care about that's coming in contact with that hazard. So it would be my body coming in contact with a car. Don't want that to happen, right? So I mitigate that risk by looking both ways before I cross the street. Pretty simple. We do risk management every day when we start talking, when we wake up from our bed. We were taught it since we were a kid. Like I said, look both ways. Don't touch the stove when it's hot. All of these things that we do to keep ourselves safe. But when you're looking at it in a chaotic system, it's a lot harder to do. It's pretty easy to predict, like, oh, car's coming, stop, wait for it to go by. But when you have chaos and you can't really predict everything, then what do you do? How do you deal with that? We have a little bit more of a formal process that we use for dealing with chaos in that sense. And it's called a formal risk assessment. So we assess what's called the hazard. Hazard has 2 components. It's how likely is that event to happen and how intense is it supposed to happen. I think the most common one that people hear about with hazards would be floods. You have a 100-year flood. It means 2 things. It's supposed to happen every 100 years and it's going to be big. You have a 1,000-year flood. Like we just had, I just came over from Livingston. We had a 1,000-year flood in Livingston. It might happen every 1,000 years and is really big. So hazard, and some of these hazards that we talk about and already like convey some form of likelihood. How often are they going to occur and how intense are they going to be? And we predict this kind of stuff in wildfires too. How likely is it that a fire is going to burn in any given chunk of ground? And how intense do we expect it to be? Do we expect it to be this raging crown fire or just kind of smoldering around on the ground? Those are very different fires. The second part of this whole process is exposure. So like I said, if you just had a hazard out there and you didn't care about anything interacting with it, it wouldn't matter. It just happens. But we have values. We have things such as our cells, our homes, our water supplies, our grazing allotments. We have our timber. We have a lot of different values out in the landscape that come in contact with that hazard. So we have to assess how likely is it that you're going to come in contact with that hazard. And then what's the outcome of coming in contact with that. So I like to think about it in terms of lightning. Everybody says that it's very unlikely that you're going to get struck by lightning, right? Walking down the street, probably not going to get struck by lightning. Even if there's a lightning storm going overhead, it's very, your chances of getting struck by lightning are very low. But if you're out on a mountain and a lightning storm comes over you and you're on a rock ridge, all of a sudden your exposure goes way up because your chances of getting hit by lightning much greater. Now, you're in a spot, you're in a position where lightning's more likely to hit. So you've changed your risk by changing your exposure. I've been in this situation before. It's really scary. Anybody been in the alpine situation when it's lightning out?
When the
Does
clouds
not-
are coming at eyeball level.
Right? And you almost feel like all of the hairs standing up on your arms, even if it's not, it feels like it. Yeah, that's pretty scary stuff. You want to get out of that situation right away because you know what's going to happen if you get hit by lightning. It's not going to be a good outcome, right? We do have some risks that we take that have great outcomes. Like some people want to buy a lottery ticket. Anybody in here buy lottery tickets? We got it. We got one person buying a lottery ticket. All right. So Powerball, your chances of winning the Powerball, it's like 1 in 2.9 million. Very, very unlikely that you're going to win the Powerball, but people still buy lottery tickets all the time because your consequences of not winning the lottery are pretty low. You're out a couple bucks, right?
But
if you won-
somebody wins.
If you won, man, that outcome, a great outcome, you know? And interestingly, Yellowstone supervolcano, it's about 700 times more likely to go off than it is that you're going to win the Powerball. So leave that out there. So what I'm talking about is how we call quantitative risk. And how do we do this? This is a really simple game, simple math. I bet you didn't think that in ecology class I'm going to throw math at you. But say I ask you for $4 to flip a fair coin, and if it lands on heads, you get $10. And if it lands on tails, you win no money. So the question would be, would you play? I have a feeling at least one person in the audience would say yes. Anybody else? You got a lot of people saying yes. So from an economist point of view, what we do is we multiply out the chances that you're going to win times how much you would win, and you multiply that or add that to the chances that you're going to lose times how much you would lose. And the expected value of this game would be $5. So I asked you for $4 to play. We're expecting that you're going to win 5. So from a mathematical standpoint, you should play the game. The odds are in your favor. But we have different risk preferences. So some people are risk adverse, and some people are risk takers. In the fire world, we call risk takers stunt jumpers. So how we manage our risk really is a personal preference sometimes, but we can give people support. We call it decision support to help you make a better decision when you're out there. And that's what I do. We use simulation modeling to look at the likelihood that fire is going to move across different landscapes while a fire is burning. We have a lot of information here. There's still a chaotic process. So how do we deal with that uncertainty? We simulate hundreds of thousands of options. We're like, well, one of these options is likely to happen. And we just, that gives us a likelihood that fire is going to move into different situations. So if you're in the zone where you're like in this red zone here, 90% chance that 80% chance or greater that fire is going to hit your chunk of ground. And if you live in a home in that area, probably you're going to be in an evacuation zone. When you get into these other areas out here where maybe it's only a 1% chance that the fire could get over there, it could still get over there. We have surprising events happen to us all the time. Once again, chaos. But you might not be in an evacuation spot yet. But let's talk about evacuation planning, because I just think it's the most important thing that we need to do as community members and as anything. It's just, we do fire drills, we come up with evacuation routes all the time for buildings, right? We have like these cool little signs that tell you where to go. We don't have that in fire prone areas. So when we start seeing these fires, these 2-3% that are moving really fast under winds now, a lot of people don't even know where they should drive. And that can be scary if you've only got one way in, one way out, you pick the wrong way. And you're heading towards the fire. It can also be, that's what happened essentially within Paradise. There was a one way in, one way out, and it got clogged and nobody could get out. So pretty scary stuff. It's happened in other fires as well in the past, but that's the most recent one that people are pretty concerned about. So from a community planning perspective, getting your evacuation routes, make sure that you have more than one evacuation route. It's really important. If you're out there buying your first home and you want to buy it in the middle of the forest, make sure you have more than one way out. This here's just some quick statistics for Montana. A third of Montana homes are in high to moderate wildfire risk. The number of homes in high to moderate risk has doubled since the 90s. And this expands the entire state, whether you're in grasslands, shrublands, or the southern central regions of the state. So it's all over the place. It's not just in the trees. So we have some increasing risk. More people, more infrastructure, more expenses. Fires are still inevitable. Climate's increasing that uncertainty. So what are we going to do about it? You know, one of the things that we do, like I said, we use these risk assessments to engage the fire before they start. We can start predicting where fires are going to go and how likely they are to occur in any chunk of ground way before they break out, which is really handy because then we can start going to those homeowners and we can start saying, hey guys, maybe we need to do some fuel treatments on your landscape. Maybe we need to clear some trees out, make it safer for firefighters to get in there. There's a lot of things that firefighters can do as well, or homeowners can do as well. We'll get to that in just a second. But we've talked about prescribed fire a little bit too. This is a really powerful tool that we have to fight these bigger fires. We get to choose when we light a prescribed fire instead of letting nature choose for us. So we don't have to choose the most extreme day out there. We can choose a year that's a lot wetter, a year that's a little bit cooler. You know, we can kind of control a little bit of that. There's still some risk and uncertainty associated with this. I've seen people light fires and with snow on the ground. 2 days later, things heat up and the fire burns out of where we were expecting it to. So there's always going to be some level of risk, but we can be a little more calculated about it. This here is just a quick picture of an area that was thinned, but they didn't do any prescribed fire. And then the fire came through and it still scorched the landscape pretty good. So just thinning in and of itself doesn't really do a whole lot for our landscapes. But when you thin and burn, it does a lot. This here was like followed the exact outlines of a prescribed fire, pretty much. And this is a fire down in Colorado that caused a lot of soil issues for the Denver city, and water is still dealing with sediment loads from this fire. Prescribed fire really did a good job of moderating what kind of fire we saw in there. Again, we talked about those fuel breaks. So didn't stop the fire from, spotting over here, but where they thinned right around the houses, it stopped the fire from reaching the things that we really cared about. So it might not take out your whole landscape. You might be able to really influence how fire reacts right around your home. And that's the biggest thing that homeowners can do, you guys can do. Start looking at ways to build, they call them Firewise homes. There's a whole program on this that you can look up into, building with materials that don't burn as easily. Some of it's really simple, like you put your firewood far away from your deck instead of underneath your deck. You build a nice wood-proof or metal deck or something that's not going to burn, and then you put all of your firewood on top of it. It doesn't help out too much. So anyway, these are some things that we've been talking through, trying to say this is where our fire management community really needs to go. This is kind of where I work. with the science and research and trying to provide better recommendations and guidelines on this side. But there's a lot of stuff that local communities can work in. I put evacuation planning up front because it's the most important in my mind. Get people out. I mean, you can rebuild your home, but obviously a life lost is much more egregious. So we want to get people out of the way, and if people evacuate you, just leave your house. It's fine. It's okay. But again, with these chaotic events, this comes back to fire ecology. You're going to have some winners. These are some creatures that really do well right after fire, from sage grouse to all kinds of woodpecker species. Elk actually really like burned areas, and aspen come back quite well after burns, and they come in, they eat all of the carbon off from trees. It's pretty cool to see. But there's going to be some losers. The fisher don't respond all that well to fire. They want old growth habitat. Their habitat got reset. Some of the owl species that might have gotten reset also. So this happens in nature. These are part of our cycles. We have winners and we have losers in all of these events. It doesn't mean that one's better than the other. Of course, it's going to be the same way with homes. So you're going to have winners, people who, harden their assets, and you're going to have losers. And the hard part, I think, to get across here is that these two homes could have been built of the same exact material. They could have had the same kind of hardening around both of those houses. And one burnt down, their neighbors didn't. Why? I don't know. I don't know. I can't tell you that reason. You'll have some scientists try to give you some nice explanation for it, but I'm going to chalk it up to chaos. Where there's just no full way to predict this sometimes. You can increase your chances of surviving your house by doing a lot of those fire-wise things, but there's always going to be a slight chance, small chance. Hopefully, you're never going to get it to zero, though, that your house is going to burn down. We live in these fire-adapted systems, so I just want to put a reality check out there for people, because sometimes it's like, oh, this is all like puppies and rainbows, and if you do these things, you're going to be 100% fine, but it's a chaotic system, and you may not be. There's always going to be risk out there. So again, get back to that evacuation planning. And this comes back to the culture. You asked if fire is a cultural process, and it absolutely is. And I think we're in the point where we need a cultural transformation, where we need to start accepting the hard truths that are surrounding fires out there. So from the fire management community, we need to accept that, hey, we're not going to catch every fire under initial attack. We're going to lose some, but we don't have to lose firefighters. From a local government perspective, private sector, you guys sitting in the room, we may need to accept that we might lose some homes, but we don't have to lose the lives associated with those homes, right? There's a lot of these hard truths that we're going to have to start thinking about. There's going to be smoke in the air. Things might get worse before they get better, but this is what it means to live with fire. So when you hear people saying we need to learn to live with fire, this is it. There's some realities here. And a lot of people might be sitting in the room wondering, what the heck? Is this worth it? Do I want to live in a system like this? And it kind of brings me to my last definition of chaos. The last definition of chaos, also from physics, is that it's a formless matter supposed to have existed before the creation of the universe. And I think that really kind of brings it all 360 with fire, because there's a hint of something chaotic happened before rebirth, right? And that happens with fire. So you start seeing the seedlings coming back, the forest regrows, all of the flowers pop up within a year. It's really beautiful. If you walk through a burnt forest, the amount of wildfires that you'll see is astonishing. The elk start coming back. They hang out. They don't mind it. They come back in and they eat the charcoal, like I said. We start recreating in it. Skiing through burnt trees is pretty fun. So I'm going to leave you guys with a modified version of a quote from Ed Abbey. If you haven't read much Ed Abbey yet in your life, you should do so. And it is, do not burn yourselves out. It is not enough to fight for the land. It is even more important to enjoy it. So get out there and hunt and fish and mess around with your friends. Ramble out yonder and explore the forest, climb the mountains, bag the peaks, run the rivers, breathe deep of that yet sweet and lucid air. Sit quietly for a while and contemplate this precious stillness stillness, the lonely, mysterious, and awesome space. And I guarantee this, living with wildfire will be worth it. That's it. I didn't leave a ton of time for questions. I'm sorry. I was hoping that I would talk faster, but I didn't. But this here is one of my favorite cartoons here. We've considered every potential risk except the risk of avoiding all risk. So there's a risk associated with that. Go ahead.
You were pushing on evacuation plans a lot. Are they starting to do like evacuation management, like planned routes, things like that?
Some communities more so than others. Not as much as I would like to see it. Evacuation planning in general lies with the sheriff's department, and
So it's community by community.
it's community. Yep. It's not Forest Service wouldn't come evacuate you. It's the sheriff that comes and evacuates you. So that planning is your emergency response planning by county typically. So you can reach out to your county planners. I know in my community, the county has some evacuation plans, but the city of Livingston doesn't. So I've been pushing for that for them to consider. So push your local representatives to get some good evacuation plan. Go ahead.
Can you talk more about deterrents for folks building in like high-risk wildfire zones? I feel like I hear those stories if there's been a wildfire and then they go
They
and
rebuild.
right there
Yeah.
again, and so
They're like
I know the
Aspen.
insurance premiums, I think the insurance premiums are fairly high, but are there other deterrents?
There are in Montana. No, we don't have a whole lot of regulations in Montana when it comes to determining where you can and can't build. Some states are starting to adopt more stringent wildfire regulations. Montana has adopted what's called a WUI code. So if you live in the wildland urban interface, which is an area where you're likely to come in contact, there are certain building restrictions, one of which is new subdivisions should have more than one egress, which is your evacuation route, way in and out. But not a whole lot of other policies going on in our state on that front. There's been some speculation that you could, through free market, buy up those lands and not let people build on them. It creates some interesting issues with social justice and equity, though. The only people that can live there are the extremely wealthy who have bought up all the land around them, and maybe, so it's tricky. It's a tricky situation. I personally would say if I was going to buy a house in a really high risk area, I would have a firebox with all of my memorabilia in it, and I would be ready to leave. And just accept that that's part of what could happen. It might not, and hopefully it doesn't, and it would be devastating if it did. But it's kind of like when you talk to people who live on like the beach and they just get hit with hurricane after hurricane, and they're like, I'm not leaving. I love it here. And they've accepted that that's their risk. Good.
I apologize if I ask a bad, ignorant question. I'm just a historian, but I read Peter Wohlleben,'s Hidden Life of Trees.
Mm-hmm.
And if I remember correctly, he argued in that book that old growth forests, the canopy is so thick that there's very little sunlight gets down to the bottom of the forest, the ground, and you have very little fuel as a result of that. And that's the best way to prevent these really terrible fires, is to have old growth forests.
So,
which is not, I guess,
Yeah.
utopian.
well, my response to that would just be that what I was saying before is it depends. There's a lot of different systems out there, and they all react differently. So if you were to go to an old growth ponderosa system that's savanna driven down in Arizona, you would see at most 2 to 3 trees per acre. You can go to an old growth system of a wet mix com system up in Northern California, maybe the Western Cascades, and you're looking at 500 trees per acre. Much more dense. That's where the spotted owls hang out. They're much more fire resistant. They're super fire resistant. And then you can go to the dry mixed conifer systems next to it, and that's more what you're talking about. And that shading of the canopy does keep the forest floor cooler. And every system's just evolved differently. So we love to be able to put us all into the same box and say, we've got a solution. This is the solution. And there's just not one solution for everywhere, because they all burn differently. They all evolved differently. So it's really hard for me also. I was like, I could just spend the entire thing talking about all of these different systems and how every single one of them is unique. And there's a lot of different solutions that would be appropriate for each of those systems. Lodgepole, this is lodgepole. We have a lot of lodgepole around here. The only way it burns is like this. And it needs fire to regenerate. But when you need to get the fire going in there, it becomes a standard placing high severity fire. That's just how it burns. In Canada, this is how they do their prescribed burning. We don't do that down here. Banff National Park, they lit their fires on, they just let them go. But every system's so different that it's, like I said, it's really appealing to want to come up with one solution to generalize across them all, but we can't.
What's the life cycle of the lodgepole forest? About 80 years?
It can be 100 to 300.
300?
Yeah.
What part of it?
Upwards of 300 years between fire return intervals. Takes them a while to get growing again. They grow in pretty, especially the lodgepole forests around here, are pretty crappy soils. I can use that word. Non-nutrient filthy. They'll grow wherever. Go ahead.
You briefly mentioned how the fires around Denver affected the sediment modes. Could you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah. Once you have a system has trees in there, the trees and the roots are really anchoring those soils down. So if you have a high severity fire come through, it gets rid of all that root system and burns up all that vegetation that's holding those soils in place. And in systems like the Southwest and up into Colorado, what happens right following their fire season, which is earlier than ours is up here, their fire season's more, it can start a lot earlier down there, more like April, May. And then they get these monsoons right after and all of this moisture that comes in. And once you have about 3 years after you have a high severity fire that your soils are really unstable because they don't have any vegetation holding them in place. And you get these big rain events and everything starts moving all at once. And it's called post-fire debris flows. And it's a big issue. Flagstaff, Arizona had some pretty good ones this year from a fire that burned 2 years ago. Just incredible mudslides going all the way through town. The city of Las Vegas, New Mexico is experiencing that right now too, from their fire just this summer. And that'll continue for about 3 years. So land management agencies do go out and try to prevent some of that mass landslides from happening if they can. Sometimes they'll plant some grasses in there temporarily until the natural vegetation can come back in just to stabilize the soil. Again, they do that for us, not so much for the ecosystem, because we are depending on the water that comes out of them.
So much. I think if some of the students have a couple questions at the end, hang out and ask them afterwards. But just checking the time. I just want to say thank you so much.
Sorry I went over, guys.
No.
You can ask me. I can hang out.
It's great. They're taking